It was one of those Oxford evenings when the rain seems reluctant to fall, suspended, rather in a fine hesitation between mist and memory. I had left the radio on, though I wasn't listening. Elgar played faintly through the static, and I was watching a drop of water slide down the rim of my glass, wishing I could recall the clue I'd abandoned halfway through the Times crossword. 6 across. One who calls but does not speak. 7. I remember thinking how curiously apt that clue would become. They rang me just past midnight. The duty sergeant's voice was formal, uncertain, as though rehearsing bad news. A woman dead in North Oxford. No signs of disturbance. A locked door. A phone off the hook. I told him I'd come after I'd found my coat. I hadn't been asleep anyway. Banbury Road lay slick and reflective, the pavements shining with that tired municipal glow that makes loneliness look respectable. Number 47 was a small Edwardian villa set back from the street, the kind of house that seems to listen rather than speak. A constable stood by the gate, dripping under his helmet. Inside, the lights were low, the air faintly scented with wine and polish. She sat rested in her armchair by the hearth, one hand still near the telephone, the receiver dangling like a forgotten promise. Margaret Henslow, the uniformed man said, retired music teacher, lived alone. He spoke with that brisk pity peculiar to the newly initiated. I nodded, though my attention had already wandered not to the body, but to the composition of the scene. A record player stood nearby, the turntable empty yet still revolving. On the table beside her, 2 wine glasses, one half full, one washed and turned upside down, the rim catching a tremor of light. Lewis arrived 20 minutes later, smelling faintly of wet wool and petrol. He glanced once at the woman, then at me. Another lonely one, he murmured. I told him loneliness was rarely fatal, but often invited company it didn't deserve. He didn't reply. There were no signs of violence, no scattered papers, no overturned chair, no trace of struggle. Her face bore the calm pallor of someone who had merely drifted from one silence into another. The paramedics had gone. The doctor had written natural causes on a provisional note. Heart failure, perhaps, but there was a detail. Trivial and dissonant, the position of the receiver, twisted slightly, as though caught mid-motion. It seemed absurd, yet I felt certain she had reached for it, answered, and heard something she did not expect. In her study, a modest room lined with music scores and thin volumes of verse, the air was colder. I noticed a Yeats anthology on the desk, opened at a page I knew too well. The living can never be as quiet as the dead. The line had been underlined twice, in pencil, not ink. I touched the edge of the paper. It trembled faintly under the draft. Nearby, a decanter half empty. I poured a finger's worth, let it linger on the tongue. Cheap claret. No bitterness, no trace of poison. Only a sadness of habit. Lewis found a neighbor willing to talk, a Mrs. Partridge, who described hearing a phone ring around 9 that evening. It went on for a long time. Then stopped. I asked if she'd heard voices. Only one, she said. A woman's voice, faint, saying, "Hello? Who is this?" And then nothing. The kind of nothing that lingers. Outside, the bells of street aldates began to toll slow, dampened notes falling through the drizzle. I stood at the gate, the constable's torch glinting off puddles, and thought of the crossword again, one who calls but does not speak. A word formed, uncertainly, at the edge of my mind. Silencer. No, too deliberate. Perhaps phantom. Too fanciful. I closed my notebook. Driving back through the rain, I caught my reflection in the mirror, pale, distracted, and faintly ashamed of how alive I looked. The city lay behind me like a wet painting, the college towers dissolving into mist. Somewhere a phone must have been ringing, perhaps in some other lonely house, unanswered, unremarked, and I wondered, as I often did, whether we ever truly heard what others were trying to say. I left the case file unopened on my desk that night. Yet, even as I tried to sleep, the sound of that unanswered call kept replaying itself, not loud, but steady, like the slow dripping of something unresolved. And when morning came, and Lewis arrived with coffee and the day's crossword, I already knew that 6 across would not leave me alone. Morning arrived with the faint, grey indifference that Oxford reserves for the living. The city looked half-drowned under a veil of drizzle, its spires blurred like thoughts one wishes not to think. I stood by the window of Margaret Henslow's sitting room, listening to the hesitant tick of a clock that seemed determined to mark time more gently for the dead. Lewis moved about the house with his usual decency, careful not to disturb anything, though his heavy shoes betrayed him on the old parquet. He was speaking, I think, about the coroner's preliminary findings: heart failure, nothing untoward, a life quietly concluded. I said very little. Death by natural causes often seemed the most unnatural of all. Margaret Henslow had been, by all accounts, an unremarkable woman in the kind of way that requires great effort. Retired music tutor from Street, Hilda's, unmarried, a small pension, a circle of acquaintances who mistook civility for friendship. Yet there were traces of disquiet in her orderliness, a faintly misaligned picture frame, a drawer locked from within, and on the piano, a sheet of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, marked with pencil slashes that looked more like wounds than notes. The neighbor, Mrs. Partridge, again received us with that proprietary curiosity of those who live adjacent to tragedy. She wore her cardigan like armor and spoke in confidential murmurs, as though tragedy might overhear. Margaret had been, she said, peculiar about her telephone in recent weeks. Sometimes she'd answer before it rang, as though she knew, and only a few days ago, over the hedge, she'd said she was expecting a call from the past. Mrs. Partridge found this poetic, though she clearly didn't understand it. A call from the past. The phrase stayed with me long after we left the house, like a half-remembered line of verse. Later, in the study, I found Yeats. The volume was worn, soft at the spine, pages furred with age and thumbed affection. On one leaf a single line had been underlined twice, the pencil pressed deep into the paper. The living can never be as quiet as the dead. I ran my finger over it, feeling the indentation rather than the words. The mark was recent. She'd read it again, perhaps the night she died. Lewis came in carrying the wine bottle and the 2 glasses we'd noted before. He thought he'd found our first contradiction, the second glass, recently washed, yet faintly smudged by a print too blurred for certainty. He asked if I thought she'd had company. I told him she had certainly intended to. Then, almost to myself, that silence was a difficult thing to share, but people often tried. We searched the drawers, no letters, no bills beyond the usual, no sign of distress or blackmail. But there was a peculiar tidiness about her life, as though she'd been putting her affairs in order without quite knowing why. In a photograph on the mantelpiece, she stood outside a college window beside a man whose face had been cleanly cut away, leaving only her faint smile, unmoored. I wondered what sort of memory one feels compelled to excise so precisely. Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. I said that a woman who kept a half glass of wine beside her and turned on a record player that played nothing was waiting, not leaving. He said, waiting for what? I said perhaps for the past to call. When we finally left, the afternoon had drawn in, prematurely dark. The streets glistened, and the hum of traffic carried that peculiar Oxford melancholy, the sound of intellect worn thin by rain. At the corner by Magdalen, a busker was playing Rachmaninoff on a weathered upright, the music ghosting through the mist like something that refused to die properly. I gave him £1, and he nodded without gratitude. Back in the office, Lewis filled out his report while I stared at the crossword folded on my desk. Yesterday's clue came to mind again. One who calls but does not speak. 7. I had tried phantom. It hadn't fit. Tonight, another word offered itself, echoist. Not in the dictionary, of course, but there are many truths that lexicons fail to recognize. I thought of Margaret Henslow, then her quiet room, her listening house. The phone that rang in the silence, and for reasons I could not articulate, I felt that the echo was not hers. It had come from somewhere older, deeper, still unanswered. And so I wrote her name on the file, underlined it once, and closed it gently, as one closes a book that has begun to whisper. There are few sounds more deceptive than the quiet of an Oxford college in the rain. It pretends at peace, but it is the peace of a stage between performances, curtains drawn, ghosts waiting for their cue. I remember the drizzle that afternoon, the way it flattened the ivy on the chapel wall and darkened the cobblestones of Street Hilders. The porter, an old soldier with roamy eyes, signed us in with the solemnity of one admitting visitors to a shrine. Lewis kept his coat on. He disliked colleges, found them airless, too polite to be honest. He was right, though I'd never have admitted it. We were met in the senior common room by Dr. Stephen Allardyce, the kind of man who had long ago mistaken his vanity for intellect. He spoke at length about Margaret Henslow, or rather, about her position within the faculty hierarchy, her modest scholarship, her quiet decency, her apparent lack of ambition. Allardyce was one of those who remembered people chiefly by the degree to which they admired him. He offered us tea, which I declined, and went on to explain that Miss Henslow had been a gifted pianist once, though temperamentally unsuited to greatness. The phrase was delivered with such satisfaction that it revealed more about him than about her. He recalled her final recital in the hall, something by Rachmaninoff, played too slowly, he thought. But there had been feeling. Yes, quite a lot of feeling, he conceded, as if it were an unfortunate excess, like perfume in a lecture room. Lewis, ever the diplomat, asked whether Miss Henslow had any close friends in college. Allardyce hesitated, then said, Fiona Catesby perhaps, though one could never be sure with young women. He smiled when he said it. A small, private smile that made me wonder whether Fiona had reason to dislike him. Fiona Catesby was waiting in the music library, a room that smelled of dust, varnish, and the faint acidity of ambition. She was younger than I'd expected, late 30s perhaps, with an anxious intelligence that moved restlessly behind her eyes. She spoke fondly of Margaret, then defensively, then with a weariness that betrayed the half-truths people tell to protect themselves. Margaret had been her mentor, she said, her friend. They'd argued over tempo, phrasing, the value of restraint in performance. Margaret believed music should ache. Fiona preferred it clean. I asked whether Miss Henslow had seemed troubled lately. Fiona looked toward the rain-fogged window. Only by memory, she said. Then, after a pause, she mentioned a curious thing. Years ago, when she was still a student, someone had made a habit of ringing Miss Henslow's room late at night and hanging up. A silly prank, she said. Everyone had forgotten who it was. I asked whether the calls had stopped, she said eventually. I asked whether Margaret had ever told her who it was. Fiona smiled thinly. She said it didn't matter, but her fingers, resting on the spine of a score, began to tap a slow, deliberate rhythm, 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, as though her hand remembered something her mouth refused to say. The last of the trio was Edmund Ryle, a widower and lecturer in philosophy who'd once accompanied Margaret in small college recitals. His rooms were lined with books whose spines were softened by touch. The air smelled of pipe smoke and dust. He spoke quietly, as if every word required effort. He remembered Margaret as a fine mind, self-contained, unassuming. She had suffered, he said, from the kind of solitude that isn't chosen but inherited. When I asked about the telephone calls, he looked at me too steadily. There are pranks, he said, that aren't meant to amuse. Then he changed the subject to Yeats, oddly enough, and the tension between art and morality. I let him talk. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A much younger Ryle, a woman I took to be his late wife, and a third figure half-cropped by the frame, Margaret Henslow. Lewis, waiting by the door, shifted his weight impatiently. We'd been there too long. As we left, I noticed a stack of old recital programs by the door. The top one was dated 1972. Margaret's name appeared beside Ryle's, followed by a student soloist whose name had been struck through with a single black line. The ink had bled faintly into the paper, as though trying to erase itself. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the quadrangle slick and gleaming. I paused under the archway, listening to the water trickle from a gutter. A prank call, a missing name, a woman who'd loved silence more than company. Lewis asked if I'd learned anything. "Only that memory lies better than most suspects," I said. And as we walked away, I thought I heard a faint ringing from somewhere deep within the college. Not loud, but insistent, as though the past were still on the line, waiting to be answered. There is a peculiar quiet that comes over a house once its owner has gone, not the silence of vacancy, but of withheld breath. That afternoon, as Lewis and I went through Margaret Henslow's papers, I felt it again, that strange politeness the dead extend to the living, as though waiting to see what we will do with their secrets. Lewis was the one who found it. The letter lay folded inside a book of Schumann's Lieder, unposted, unsent, unfinished, addressed only to E.R., the initials written in a hurried, almost defensive hand. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old ink, the edges soft with age. He read it first, aloud but quietly, as if afraid of being overheard by the walls themselves. She wrote of regret, of something she had long carried. There was a line about that night, a promise to tell the truth, and then a sentence abruptly crossed out. "We were all to blame, not only you." The rest was fragmentary thoughts trailing off mid-word, the ink darker where her hand must have paused too long. Lewis asked whether E.R. might be Edmund Ryle. I said it was more than possible. It was certain. The tone of the letter troubled me. It hovered somewhere between confession and warning, remorse, perhaps, or accusation disguised as forgiveness. I've learned that people rarely write letters for the purpose of sending them. They write to make silence bearable. We went to see Ryle that evening. The rain had returned, fine and persistent, veiling the lamps along Merton Street in pale halos. His rooms were, as I remembered, untidy in the way of men who once lived with women. Books leaned against bottles, papers spread like tired arguments across the table. He looked older, or perhaps simply more exposed in that light. He poured 2 glasses of port without asking. When I mentioned the letter, he flinched almost imperceptibly. But enough. I told him it was never posted. He said softly that Margaret had been sentimental in her last years, given to revisiting old griefs. I asked whether he knew Philip Crowthorne. His eyes moved, just once, toward the mantelpiece where a photograph stood 1972, I guessed from the clothes. 3 figures, Margaret in the center, younger by decades. Ryle, his arm resting almost protectively behind her, and a third man, sharp-faced, uncertain the student. Crowthorne. He told us the boy had been troubled, that there had been an unfortunate incident, and that he'd taken his own life soon after. The college had handled it discreetly, as colleges do. The words were tidy, but the pause before them was not. Lewis, blunt as always, asked what sort of incident. Ryle gave that small, tragic smile reserved for those who believe they have suffered enough to deserve immunity. He said it was disciplinary, academic, nothing more. But as he spoke, he adjusted the photograph slightly, as though seeking to bring the dead back into proper alignment. It was a gesture that told me far more than his words. Back in the car, the rain gathered on the windscreen in erratic trails, like writing being erased as it was written. Lewis asked what I thought. I said I thought Crowthorne hadn't killed himself for academic reasons. There's a tone in certain tragedies, a moral timbre that books and lectures can't produce. That night, in my flat, I asked for the coroner's file. It arrived by courier the next morning, a thin folder bound with red tape and indifference. The report was efficient. Male, 22, death by hanging, no evidence of foul play. But one line caught my eye, a note about the condition of the hands, small abrasions on the knuckles, as though he had struck something before dying. I thought of the photograph again, his eyes, defiant, almost pleading. I poured myself a whiskey and let the file rest open on the desk. Outside, the city was darkening into its usual melancholy, the bells marking each passing quarter with ecclesiastical patience. I recalled Margaret's underlined Yeats. The living can never be as quiet as the dead. Perhaps she had not been speaking of herself at all. Lewis would later suggest that I was chasing phantoms. Perhaps I was. But something in that unsent letter, its unfinished tone, its refusal to end neatly, had the shape of guilt. And guilt, I've learned, never stays buried. It calls, softly at first, then insistently, until someone answers. I closed the file, and for a moment, the silence of the room felt almost like waiting. The office was nearly empty by the time I returned. The rain had followed me from Banbury Road, a steady whisper against the windows, not enough to drown thought, only to make it slower. Lewis was sorting through the contents of a cardboard box taken from Margaret Henslow's house. Among the usual relics of solitude, letters, bills, a few books still faintly scented of dust and time, there was the answering machine, the kind with little red bulbs that blinked like exhausted hearts. He plugged it in without ceremony. The machine clicked, whirred, and began to play. Most of the messages were banal, their voices briskly kind. An optician's reminder, a colleague's pleasantry, a charity appeal spoken with false warmth. Then came the last one, a faint male voice, distorted, half eclipsed by static. "You never told." Just that. A pause, and then the soft crackle of nothing. Lewis frowned, said it was probably an old message, recycled or corrupted. "These machines," he said, "sometimes record themselves." I told him they sometimes do more than that. He looked at me the way he often did, half worried, half resigned. I replayed the message. The tone was deliberate, intimate, almost tender. Not accusation, not threat. Something quieter. It had been received, the log showed, at 11:47 p.m. The coroner placed her death around 9. I rang the phone company myself. A patient young man, rehearsed in disbelief, told me their records showed no incoming call at that time. He sounded faintly amused when I asked whether their records ever lied. "Machines," he said, "don't lie." I thanked him and hung up before explaining that people do, especially when they build machines to speak for them. Lewis suggested we were dealing with a recording anomaly, a delayed playback, some ghost of a signal. I told him ghosts rarely bothered with schedules. He said I was tired, that I'd been too long in rooms that smelled of rain and regret. He was right, but tiredness has never excused curiosity. We sat there a while, listening to the rain. I poured a little whiskey into 2 paper cups from the vending machine. It tasted of metal and late hours. Lewis asked again what I made of the voice. I said it reminded me of someone reading a line aloud to test its truth. The phrase, "you never told," echoed oddly against the office walls, as though the building itself had been waiting to hear it. When he left, I stayed. I wanted to listen once more, not to the message, but to the silence that followed it. There's always something in silence, if you know how to listen. On the 3rd playback, I noticed a detail I hadn't before, just before the voice, a faint scraping sound, like a chair being moved on stone. And then, after the words, the barest suggestion of breathing. Not machine noise, human. The kind of sound people make when they've said something they wish they hadn't. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dim glow of the streetlight that leaked through the blinds. The city beyond was indistinct towers softened by mist, the soft shuffle of late footsteps. Somewhere, a bell marked the half-hour. I thought of Margaret, her hand frozen mid-reach for the telephone, the way her house had felt as if it were listening. The underlined Yeats returned to me. The living can never be as quiet as the dead. Perhaps she had understood that better than most. I began to wonder whether guilt might possess its own frequency, not loud enough for others, but sufficient for those who've shared it. Maybe the dead do not call, maybe the guilty simply replay them. The whiskey was gone by the time the tape ended its final whir. I sat back and imagined that faint male voice again, detached from tape and static, carried through the night like an unfinished confession. You never told. I thought about who might have wanted her to. Allardyce, with his self-satisfied cruelty? Fiona, hiding behind youthful indignation? Ryle, whose eyes had flinched too slowly when I mentioned the student's name. The rain deepened outside a softer rhythm now, as if the city were breathing in its sleep. I switched off the machine and waited in the dark for a while longer, listening to the echo it had left behind. The kind of echo that doesn't fade, only changes rooms. I didn't sleep that night. Some silences, I've found, are not meant to be escaped. They follow you home, sit in your chair, and whisper, not in words but in pauses. You never told. There are evenings in Oxford when the air itself seems tuned not to weather, but to memory. That night, the Sheldonian was full to the galleries. The orchestra tuned with the familiar, half-sincere chaos of professionals pretending to need one another. I had come alone. Though I rarely admit to doing anything alone, Lewis had begged off, muttering something about noises that don't even have words. I saw them as soon as I entered. Allardyce, unmissable in a velvet waistcoat too red for the century, and beside him, Fiona Catesby. The pairing struck me as wrong, the way two notes occasionally clash by accident and pretend not to notice. She leaned toward him often, smiling with the effort of youth accommodating arrogance. He, for his part, nodded, as if to remind her that attention was a privilege. The music began. Schubert, The Death, and the Maiden Quartet. A sentimental choice for a college fundraiser, though I doubted anyone there understood its irony. The melody, soft, pleading, almost embarrassed by its beauty, filled the hall. I closed my eyes briefly, and for a moment I thought I heard Margaret Henslow's playing. She had once been fond of Schubert, not for the tenderness, but for the restraint, emotion behind glass, she'd called it. I wondered what she would have thought of Allardyce humming along, slightly off-key. After the final applause, I found them by the vestibule. Allardyce was pontificating about tempo, as though the musicians had erred by not consulting him first. I joined them, too casually perhaps, and misquoted a line from Schubert's letters, something about the music that forgets it's being listened to. He corrected me instantly, his tone sharp, self-satisfied. The speed of it was revealing. People who live in deceit often polish their facts too cleanly. Fiona smiled nervously, murmuring that she had to meet a friend, and excused herself. Allardyce watched her go not with affection, but with calculation. I mentioned Margaret then, deliberately, lightly, as though her name were incidental. He said she'd been a fine woman, cultured, a little fragile. His voice carried the practiced melancholy of someone who wants credit for feeling something. I asked when he'd last seen her. He hesitated a pause so brief it could have been breath, yet enough to confirm the lie, then said it must have been years. Back outside, the rain had started again, soft and miserly. The gas lamps along Broad Street cast a dim, uncertain light. I thought of Margaret's study, the 2 wine glasses, the unfinished letter, the voice on the tape. For all his bluster, Allardyce was too cowardly for confrontation. His arrogance was defensive, the mask of a man terrified of irrelevance. Lovers rarely frightened me. Cowards often did. Later that night, Lewis came by with the forensic report. He always looked faintly apologetic when bringing science to a conversation that preferred poetry. The second glass, he said, had traces of male DNA, no fingerprints though. Whoever drank from it had wiped it clean. He looked pleased, as if the world had briefly become logical. I told him that logic was a poor companion to guilt. He asked what I meant, and I said nothing, because I wasn't sure myself. There's something about evidence that comforts the innocent more than it convicts the guilty. Lewis suggested that Allardyce might have been Margaret's lover. It would explain the secrecy, the late-night phone calls, the guilt in her letter. Perhaps, I said, but the tone of her writing was too still, too composed. It wasn't the voice of passion gone sour, it was the voice of betrayal endured too long. He frowned and asked who else it could have been. I told him I didn't know yet and poured us both a whiskey. The rain deepened outside, turning the street into a mirror of small, rippling truths. As I looked at the report again, something struck me. The wine glass had been wiped, yes, but not polished. The base, according to the lab notes, bore a faint smear as though a thumb had pressed down in hesitation before withdrawing. I imagined the motion. A man unsure whether to leave or stay, his guilt not yet rehearsed enough to be thorough. Lewis said we were close now. I told him we were only close to the obvious, and the obvious is the most dangerous disguise of all. He laughed and called me a pessimist. Perhaps I am, but as the night stretched thin and the echo of Schubert's quartet lingered somewhere between the rain and my glass, I thought again of Margaret's words, the letter that ended mid-sentence, and of music that forgets it's being listened to. The melody of deceit, I've learned, is always in tune. It was Lewis who fetched the file, though he handed it to me as if it was something that might bruise. The label read simply, Disciplinary Committee, 1972. Confidential. The paper smelled faintly of damp and dust, that peculiar scent of old shame sealed too long in orderly drawers. I told him to close the blinds. He did, though he muttered that the past rarely minded the light. Inside were minutes typed on thin carbon sheets, the words ghosting through as if unwilling to stay contained. Philip Crowthorne, undergraduate, age 22. Accused of making defamatory statements against a senior fellow, dismissed as unstable. The presiding warden, Dr. Stephen Allardyce. Witnesses, several tutors, including one, M. Henslow. I felt the familiar pulse of recognition, that faint quickening that always comes when the pattern beneath the dust begins to show itself. The record was bureaucratically cruel. Crowthorne had alleged coercion, intellectual, emotional, perhaps worse. He had claimed to be the victim of influence exerted under the guise of mentorship. The language was careful, evasive, half in code. His statement had been declared incoherent. He was sent home to his family, and a month later, he was dead. Suicide by hanging, though the coroner had chosen his adjectives with a diplomat's restraint. No suspicious circumstances. Lewis, reading over my shoulder, asked what I made of it. I said that the worst crimes in Oxford were often grammatical. He looked puzzled until I showed him a paragraph near the end, the warden's conclusion, signed in neat blue ink. The matter rests upon unfortunate misunderstanding and exaggerated sensibility. The phrasing was pure Allardyce, cruelty disguised as syntax. Margaret's name appeared twice in the minutes, once to confirm that Crowthorne had shown signs of unusual agitation, and again to assert her belief in the warden's judgment. No elaboration, no comment, just that her small signature beneath the verdict that condemned a boy to silence. I stared at the stroke of her pen, neat and obedient, and wondered how many nights she had stared at it too. Lewis said softly that perhaps she had been protecting her position. The college in those days wouldn't have forgiven a woman for taking the wrong side. Perhaps, I said. But guilt is a persistent suitor. It waits longer than any institution. He asked whether I thought the anonymous call, the one Margaret received before her death, was blackmail. The question hung in the air, too modern, too transactional. I shook my head. Blackmail requires the living to believe they can change something. What I heard in that call was older, a debt that had begun to collect interest in the silence between two deaths. I left the office near dusk. The city was turning gold and grey at once. A palette Oxford wears better than any other. The rain had stopped, but the air still held its echo, that cool, mineral quiet that makes the cobblestones look older, the spires taller, and the truth more remote. I walked toward the Radcliffe camera, its curve luminous against the dimming sky. Somewhere inside, the archivist would already be locking up, unaware that history never really shuts its doors. The words of the record followed me as I walked. Exaggerated sensibility. I'd heard that phrase before in courtrooms, classrooms, living rooms. It is the phrase used by men who fear being seen clearly. It was not a verdict. It was camouflage. At Carfax, I stopped and watched the slow spill of students crossing under umbrellas, their laughter too loud for the narrow streets. Lewis's question returned the matter of blackmail, of motive, of what had driven Margaret Henslow to answer a phone that should not have been ringing. I thought of Crowthorne's face in that photograph, the one in Ryle's rooms, his youth already weary, his expression that of someone who had glimpsed too much of a truth no one else would own. I thought of Allardyce presiding in his warden's chair, the weight of authority mistaken for virtue. And of Margaret, young and earnest, lending her signature to silence because she could not bear the sound of rebellion. Lewis would later say that guilt had finally caught up to her. But guilt does not catch. It circles. It dials. It waits. It rings again and again until someone answers. That evening, as I stood beneath the Bridge of Sighs, the bells of Street, Mary's began their slow descent into evening prayer. The sound floated through the mist like a confession left half-finished. I remember thinking then that perhaps guilt has its own operator, its own exchange, and in Oxford, at least, the line is never truly disconnected. The morning arrived grey and unsympathetic. Rain had softened overnight into a mist that clung to the streets and the spires, rendering the city indistinct, more suggestion than substance. I read the first reports while nursing a weak whiskey, the kind that tastes of paper and regret. Allardyce had been found dead in his garage. Carbon monoxide, the coroner said. An apparent suicide. Lewis was beside me, coffee in hand, eyes already red from lack of sleep. He read aloud from the press release. College mourns tragic loss of senior fellow whose private struggle ended in his garage. Apologies left for those affected. He shook his head. They called it coincidence. He asked if I believed in coincidence. I said, not in Oxford. The note had been found on the workbench. Its handwriting was familiar, neat, controlled, apologetic. For the silence that followed, I am sorry. Margaret's words replayed themselves in my memory. Underlined, incomplete. I held the page as though it might speak more clearly if I stared long enough. I had never thought Allardyce capable of self-reflection, much less remorse. The phrasing was too careful, too parallel with her letter, and that made me uneasy. Lewis suggested we start at the garage. The air was damp. The cement floor, darkened by rainwater, tracked in from the street. The car, still, stood, small plumes of condensation clinging to its roof. I examined the exhaust pipe. Nothing remarkable beyond the ordinary. A car, a garage, a man's decision, yet the human hand, I've always believed, leaves an indelible impression beyond the physical. I replayed the voicemail again, over and over, letting the tape run in the silence of my flat. You never told. The cadence gnawed at me, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in tone. I had listened to it when I first recovered it, assuming the voice belonged to some anonymous interloper, someone from the shadows of Margaret's life. But now, after Allardyce's death, the same words seemed to hold a different inflection. Urgent, quiet, almost pleading, I kept the tape running, eyes closed, until the smell of whiskey and damp filled the room. And then I realized the voice was not Allardyce's. I could see it as clearly as if I had been in the room with him. The hesitation, the slight upward inflection at the end, the emphasis on the first word. Ryle. The thoughts settled like rain in the gutters. Ryle had the measure of Margaret Henslow, knew what she would hear, what she would remember, how silence might be weaponized, and if he had called, even posthumously, it was to provoke the old truths buried beneath civility and death. Not coercion, not vengeance, curiosity, perhaps or conscience attempting to find purchase in someone who no longer existed to answer. Lewis arrived with a note from the coroner, a small, bureaucratic sheet stating that the cause of death was consistent with suicide, no toxicology anomalies. He looked at me, his brow furrowed. I told him I didn't care for consistency. Consistency is rarely truth. It is merely the convenient arrangement of facts to reassure the living. I thought of the photograph I had seen in Ryle's rooms, Margaret in the center, Ryle beside her, the young man who had died, faintly erased from memory and then from the world. I imagined the phone, ringing, the soft "you never told," the words carrying across the air in place of confession or accusation. Allardyce had merely been the screen, the fall guy, for something older and quieter, something that waited like a shadow behind each letter, each punctuation mark, each unanswered call. The rain outside had returned heavier now, drumming on the sill with the persistence of memory. I lit a cigarette, drew in the smoke, and thought of how guilt often dials its own number. Sometimes it rings, sometimes it whispers, but it always finds a listener. Lewis asked whether we should confront Ryle. I said no, not yet. Some truths are best held in suspension, in the space between voices, between deaths. In Oxford, especially, coincidences are polite lies told by time to the curious. I poured another whiskey, and the tape clicked softly, ready to play again. The words had changed, and in their repetition, I realized that the living and the dead were far less separated than we like to imagine. I went to see Ryle on a cold afternoon that smelled of rain and iron. The excuse, thin as the paper it was written on, concerned a set of music manuscripts once belonging to Philip Crowthorne, fragments of a sonata that had never been performed. He greeted me at the door with that careful civility of men who have much to hide and no intention of showing it. His study was warm, though the warmth felt borrowed, as though the fire burned from obligation rather than comfort. He poured brandy into 2 small glasses, the act practiced and unhurried. He asked if I still listened to Wagner. I said not as often. He nodded, as if that answer confirmed something. The conversation drifted to Crowthorne's music, its technical immaturity, its promise, its despair. Then, as if by accident, he quoted Yeats. I've forgotten the context now, but the misstep was clear. "Tread softly, for you tread on my grave," he said, eyes lowered. I corrected him gently. "Dreams," I said. "You tread on my dreams." The smallest silence followed, and in it something shifted, a flinch almost too brief to notice. His fingers tightened around the glass, and I heard the faint click of crystal against ring. The gesture revealed more than confession ever could. He changed the subject quickly, asked after Lewis, and spoke of the Sheldonian concert as if we'd both attended some agreeable fiction together. When I left, he offered his hand, dry and perfunctory. I remember thinking it was the hand of a man who had once begged forgiveness and found none. Later that evening, Lewis and I returned. The college porter, bribed with understatement and authority, let us in. The rain had begun again, striking the windows in long, slanted lines that made the lamplight shiver. Ryle's rooms smelled of brandy and stale paper. Lewis began his usual, methodical search drawers, cupboards, the orderly chaos of a scholar's life. It was I who found the cassette, hidden behind a row of books on metaphysics, its label faintly smudged. Henslow, 14 March. The handwriting was unmistakable his. The machine sat nearby, an old Philips model, dust layered like forgetfulness. I pressed play. The tape hissed, coughed, then began. Margaret's voice first calm, deliberate, but trembling underneath. "You let him take the blame, Edmund." Then a pause. A man's breath, uneven. "It wasn't like that," he said. "You know it wasn't." She replied, softer now. "He told me what you asked of him. He said he couldn't bear the silence afterward." There followed a rustle, a chair scraping, the sound of someone moving closer. Then his voice again, quieter. "I did what was necessary." A long pause. Then, almost inaudibly, "You never told." The tape broke into static. I let it run. More crackle, then silence until a faint ringing, far away, as though from another room. The unmistakable tone of a telephone. And then nothing. Lewis looked at me, half expecting instruction. I rewound the reel and played it again. The same words, the same soft, terrified insistence. "You never told." He asked if it was proof. I told him proof is a luxury we rarely earn. But I knew what it was, not a threat, not blackmail, but confession. Ryle had tried to erase it, perhaps after Margaret's death, perhaps before. But deletion is never as complete as guilt would like it to be. One reel had remained, just enough for the dead to speak. Lewis asked what she had meant by "he told me what you asked of him." I didn't answer. The rain against the window filled the silence more eloquently than words. Before we left, I stood a moment longer by the fire. On the mantel was a framed photograph, the same I'd seen before. Margaret, Ryle, and Crowthorne. Only now I noticed something I hadn't before. The edge of a fourth figure, half-cropped, hand resting lightly on Margaret's shoulder. Allardyce. The symmetry completed itself too easily, like the final word of a crossword one pretends not to see coming. Outside, the air tasted of wet stone and burnt leaves. Lewis asked if we should arrest him. I said not tonight. There are crimes that do not fit into reports. Some belong only to memory. As we walked past the chapel, its windows glowing faintly against the rain, I thought of Yeats again, how even misquoted, "Truth remains. Tread softly, for you tread on my dreams." Perhaps that was what Ryle had tried to do, tread lightly over the wreckage of his own conscience. But dreams, like guilt, never die when they're spoken aloud. They linger, rewound, waiting for someone to press play. It was raining again that evening, a fine, persistent rain that seemed less to fall than to linger. Oxford wore its melancholy with quiet dignity, the streets glistening like varnished grief. I'd asked them not to make a spectacle of the arrest, no handcuffs, no noise, just a quiet end to a long conversation. Ryle waited for me in his study. The fire burned low, and a bottle of claret stood half-finished on the table. He looked tired in that particular way men look when they've finally run out of lies to live inside. He asked if he might pour us both a glass. I told him yes. I wasn't there to deny a man his last small ritual. He said he hadn't meant for her to die. It began, he told me, with the letter she'd sent, or rather, hadn't sent. She had asked him to meet. He went to her house late, after the rain had started. She had been drinking, quietly, the way the lonely do. For Crowthorne, for the silence, for being the sort of man who mistakes cowardice for mercy. She had called him a liar, but without anger, only sorrow. He said her voice had thinned as they spoke, like something unraveling. She'd turned away to pick up the telephone, though it hadn't rung. And then she was on the floor. No sound, no struggle, only stillness. He'd knelt beside her, called her name. Nothing. The line had already gone dead, he said, as though the words themselves were trying to excuse him. I asked about the phone. He looked at it then, as though seeing it for the first time. He'd lifted the receiver, he said, dialed no number, heard no tone, just silence. He wanted to believe she'd been waiting for someone to call. For him, perhaps, or for the boy who'd died. So he placed the receiver back, but not properly, tilted, suspended, as though she'd just let go. Later, he'd returned and rewired the phone, left it off the hook to make it appear she'd received a call. From whom? I asked. From the living or the dead? He smiled, faintly. Both, he said. He'd recorded the message himself. The words were his confession, disguised as haunting. You never told. It was not accusation but prayer. Lewis waited by the door, shifting awkwardly. He hated the silences I allowed. But silences, I've found, tell the truth with less vanity than speech. Ryle poured another inch of wine, swallowed it slowly, and said, He'd made peace with the idea that she'd never forgive him, that her death, accidental as it was, had only completed the circle he'd drawn years ago. He didn't weep. He looked relieved, as though confession were not punishment but reprieve. When the constables came, I told them to wait outside until he was ready. He placed his glass down neatly, adjusted his tie, and followed them without a word. The door closed softly behind him. Lewis and I stood there a while, the sound of the rain against the windows filling the room. He said he didn't understand why Ryle had done it, the tampering, the tape, the pretense of voices. I said guilt often demands theater. It isn't content with silence. It needs an audience, even a dead one. As we left, the streets were slick with reflection. The lamps burned weakly through the mist, each halo trembling with uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the college walls, the bells began to toll, slow, deliberate, as if counting not the hours, but the mistakes of men. Lewis said it was a strange case, and I suppose it was, though not for the reasons he meant. "Strange, sir?" he asked again when I didn't reply. I lit a cigarette, let the smoke settle between us. "No, Lewis," I said. "Just human." He didn't speak after that. The city was too quiet to fill. We drove back through rain that refused to decide whether to fall or simply remain. At the station, the tape lay on my desk beside an empty glass. I didn't play it. Some things are better left unheard, particularly when they've already said everything. When I finally reached home, the rain had thinned to a whisper. I hung up my coat, poured a small measure of whiskey, and sat by the window. The city lights blurred in the mist, distant and indifferent, and then the sound. A telephone, ringing, once, then again. It came from my flat, from somewhere near the kitchen. I didn't move. It rang a third time. I looked at the cigarette burning itself out in the ashtray, the smoke curling upward like a question with no listener. It rang once more, then stopped. The room held its breath. I didn't answer.